You're watching Capitol View, Sunday morning talk focused on the political scene in Arkansas.
All right, joining me now for analysis, Dr. Jay Barth, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Hendrix College, Robert Coon, Managing Partner, Impact Management Group. Good to have you guys on the program. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you, Roby.
It's our favorite time of year. It's poll time. We got a lot to talk about as we have gone through already. We've got some favorable and unfavorable numbers that I want to start with first with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Joe Biden, 34% favorable among Arkansas voters, 62.5% unfavorable. Former President Donald Trump, 48% favorable, 48% unfavorable. How much of those numbers, Jay, do you think will be driving people's decision making in November?
Yeah, so I think the real change here are the Trump numbers. The Biden numbers have been fairly stable and negative kind of across his time as president in Arkansas, but the Trump numbers have dropped in recent weeks based on the last time we looked at this question, and it's obviously it's been a very challenging few months for former President Trump. I mean, the Mar-a-Lago investigation and a variety of other things that are really kind of coming together. So I do think that's the change, and I do think that Republican candidates who have really latched themselves to Donald Trump now over the last handful of cycles are kind of in a new world all of a sudden. And so I think that's the real change. The other thing that we're really seeing with Trump in particular is that independent voters have really gone south on Donald Trump. And that's the big change there. Republicans still generally supportive, Democrats of course ardently opposed, but independent voters have really begun to move in a negative direction on Trump.
And Robert, independent voters have been breaking 2-1, 3-1, sometimes 4-1 for Republican candidates. They still need some independent voters to get over that 50% hurdle. Is this going to be detrimental to Republican prospects in November?
I don't think it's detrimental, at least not at this stage. I mean, we're still in September. I think you have to be aware that there is some erosion going on, and it's very, with this environment, post a primary season, as Jay said, where everyone is moving to the right on the Republican side to be as Trumpy and as conservative as possible. You then swing out of that. You have the Dobbs decision that comes out. That's a political earthquake, and we're figuring out where the rubble is. So it's what does that environment look like in November? I would say a couple things about Trump. I think Jay's right. Trump has always built his favorability and support with getting nearly all Republicans for him, nearly all Democrats against him, and having more independents than not being in his favor, and that's kind of given him his blend, right? Very different than Asa Hutchinson, who has always gotten a solid piece of Republicans, a majority of Democrats, and a majority of independents, and build the House differently. So when you see the independents start to move, and you've kind of got that built into your function, right, it starts to change the numbers overall. I will say on Joe Biden, I think the interesting thing is, his numbers are where we think that where we think they should be based on his past performance. The interesting thing for me though is with Democrats, the number's good, but when you peel back the layer of the onion, the strongly favorable amongst Democrats is somewhere around 35%. So even among his base party, the enthusiasm is pretty low. They're on the team, but there's definitely some doubts.
I can't honestly say that surprises me, to be honest with you. I mean, even though he's had a good couple of weeks, he's had a rough presidency so far.
Yeah, and it is a little different. Some national numbers are indicating that Democrats are kind of coming home for Biden, but that does not seem to be happening fully in Arkansas. So I think that's a place where Arkansas kind of separates itself from the rest of the country.
Another issue that we polled here dealt with abortions. You mentioned the Dobbs decision earlier that overturned Roe v. Wade. We asked the question, do you support the current restrictions in Arkansas law on abortions, which is the only exception is for the life of the mother, no rape or incest exceptions. 50.5% said that the law should be changed in Arkansas. 43% said that they support the current law. We asked those that said that they wanted the law to be changed. Should it be made easier or harder? That's a pretty wide swath of potential options in that question, but it was still 92% think it should be easier. Robert, I'll come to you first. How big is this abortion decision in what you're seeing in the numbers on some of the other races.
Yeah, I mean, it was predominantly easier. I think that easier can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's really very difficult to try to test every different exception or different policy change. However, when you look at the macro picture, I mean, that's what it's telling us. Republicans are kind of where you expect them to be on this issue, in the high 70s or the mid 70s on thinking it should stay the same, although 20% of Republicans thought it should be changed. Democrats clearly the other way. It's really independents and women where the mood of the electorate is definitely on the should be changed. I think that is kind of a key indicator, and that's a high profile issue that's not going to go away. It's fresh on people's minds, and I think it's a motivating factor. And as you move into the general election, Republicans obviously being pro-life is a key core belief for a lot of people. It becomes a campaign platform. It's how do you pivot out of that primary season where that's been a high point of emphasis and start talking about issues that maybe aren't that issue when you're looking at a general electorate.
Mm-hmm. So, Jay?
Yeah, I'd add one more group to that list, and that's younger voters who really are pretty vehement in wanting change there. And those are low propensity voters. Those are folks who typically don't turn out in a midterm election. And if there is a real change in the electorate in a way in which Democrats who are typically not folks who don't turn out, if they begin to turn out, that does begin to change things a little bit. I think the impact is going to be much more impactful in other states than in Arkansas, because Arkansas is just more generally conservative on this issue and others.
Well, to that point too, I mean, and we'll talk about specific races in a second there, but I mean, maybe it makes I guess at this juncture, the conventional wisdom would be Democrats still have long shot chances to win any of the statewide or congressional races, but this may make the races tighter. Would that be a prediction?
Yeah, I don't see this changing outcomes necessarily by any means. I think we still think the people that are ahead are going to win. I do think it could affect, the margin of victory for Republican candidates, and potentially, legislative districts where things are tighter than a statewide fundamental political environment is. I think maybe it trickles there. But I do want to say one thing about Jay said about the younger voters. Younger voters definitely predominantly viewed the law should be changed. Even the older two categories were approaching 50% on that question. It wasn't a majority, but it was really close. So it's not just a complete younger voter issue, older voter issue.
Yep. Anything else to add?
Well, I think the legislative races is important in that you've got some parts of the state, especially some of the districts in Pulaski County, some of the districts up in northwest Arkansas, where I think this issue could really make a difference in a way that it's probably not going to be as meaningful in more rural areas. But you do have some competitive House and Senate races in some of those more suburban areas.
We saw some last cycle that were less than 100 votes difference between some that were decision making, and then we've had redistricting, so those districts have all been drawn again too, so we'll be getting some interesting information on that. We also asked about issue 4, which is the recreational marijuana amendment. 58.5% for, 29% against, 12.5% undecided. It appears that if this stays on the ballot, it cruises to victory.
Yeah, and that's a big if. Obviously, we still don't know if it's going to be on the ballot. Well, we know it's on the ballot. We just don't know if the votes are going to be counted. Right. And we don't know if it's going to be an active campaign in the closing weeks. But yeah, this, the story of Arkansans' attitudes about marijuana was something we've been tracking for now, I guess,
I think since 2014.
Yeah. And it's just, first it was medical, now it's recreational. I mean, this just, we've always said it's a matter of not if, but when.
You remember the first time we polled this, we had this reverse Bradley effect where it was trailing by 9 percentage points. It only failed by 2 on the ballot that year. We went out with a poll 10 days later and it was still down by 9 points. Again, people are not, it's not as taboo to talk about it now.
Not at all. I mean, when you have dispensaries on many corners in the state, I mean, it's no longer something that is taboo, as you say, and it's really normalized. And I think it's really important to point out that a marijuana industry has grown up. That is well funded and clearly is ready to go with a campaign if the Supreme Court allows the votes to be counted.
What do you see in the crosstabs on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit greater age correlation on this one. Younger voters are more inclined to be supportive, and older, I mean, it kind of slides downward as you get older in the category, but still 46% of voters over the age of 65 said they would vote for it. I mean, it's a plurality of the oldest voters, and so if there's some anti-campaign that's banking on them being automatically against it, right now they're not. It doesn't mean they couldn't be persuaded, but they're not today. The other interesting dynamic is party. I mean, I think you would assume Democrats would be more supportive of it. They are about 75%. Independents are about 63%. Republicans aren't, you don't have a majority, but you have a 4-point advantage for supporting it amongst Republicans, which to me is the whole idea that it's immediately offensive, maybe it was 6-8 years ago, but as you've seen more into people's daily life, they might know somebody who uses medical marijuana or something like that. The taboo nature of it is just kind of started to wear off.
One of the nuances that I'm kind of watching in this is how law enforcement plays out on this. Obviously, law enforcement would, you would think typically is against legalizing marijuana. It's another problem area for them to have to, watch for. But there's money in this amendment that goes specifically to law enforcement for salaries and bonuses. I think the pro-recreational marijuana folks have used law enforcement in one of their ads so far, and you have some law enforcement folks that will come out and support. Yet the governor, Hutchinson, is lobbying to get the law enforcement groups to come out against it. I mean, that's just an interesting dynamic to me.
Well, the other angle on law enforcement is, we've obviously in some areas of the state, you have issues with parole. You have violent people getting out on parole. I mean, the other side of the coin on law enforcement is, do they want to spend their time worrying about, giving people possession tickets for marijuana, or do they want to focus on, more violent crimes that are affecting people's neighborhoods? Like, not to say that, crime isn't crime, but there's varying degrees of what impacts other people. And does that become a law enforcement thing where they would maybe just want to abandon having to deal with, some of the less harmful things that are out there?
Yeah, the one thing that, if the votes are going to be counted, the no side, I think, lost a number of weeks of campaigning to try to discourage folks from voting for this. So, of course, they get the big win if it gets knocked off entirely. But if it doesn't, they needed more time to make the case against marijuana.
Might just be a big delay because, as we've mentioned, it's kind of a matter of when and not if at this juncture when you look at all of the things. All right, let's turn our attention. Let's look at some of the head-to-head candidate campaigns here. Let's start with the U.S. Senate. We asked if you would be, who you would be supporting. You got Senator John Boozman, the Republican, Natalie James, the Democrat, Kenneth Cates is the Libertarian. 43.5% for Senator John Boozman, 30.5% for Natalie James, 5% for Cates. This is basically a 13-point lead for Senator John Boozman. He's always underperforming in polling, and then we do our final poll about 3 weeks before Election Day, and there he is floating around in the high 50s.
And then he beats it on Election Day.
And then he does it on Election Day. So that's a comfortable lead for John Boozman, would you say?
It is. I mean, it continued, and I don't want to belabor something we've said again and again and again, but he is just a decidedly weak candidate who has never resonated with Arkansans fully in a way that promotes true enthusiasm. But he gets the job done. He wins election after election, and he's a fascinating candidate as a result of that. But once again, he's going to win this race. But his polling suggests a lot of Arkansans still don't know who he is, don't have an image.
Well, he's only been on the scene for 20-something years.
I'm going to disagree on weak candidate. Here's what I think about Senator Boozman. You heard it during the primary and some of the TV ads. He's a workhorse, not a show pony. I think Senator Boozman spends time working on policy issues, right? He's not seeking out Fox News. He's not seeking out OAN. He's not seeking out local TV interviews. He was instrumental in passing veterans legislation recently that helped people who were hurt from medical issues with Iraqi burn pits and contaminated water at Camp Lejeune. You didn't really hear about that, but that's really impactful type of legislating that I think most people would like to know is going on in Congress. But it's not the Fox News sensation, right? I think the flip side of kind of keeping your nose to the grindstone is every 6 years you kind of got to refresh people's memory. I think that's kind of I don't see weakness. I think it's just focusing on the job and then having to come back and kind of refresh yourself.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally you look at Senator Boozman's numbers in this survey, there are no weak spots. He's winning with all age groups except for under 30, which most Republicans don't ever win. He's winning with men. He's winning with independents. He's winning with women. There's no vulnerabilities there. There's no places where I think Natalie James could, if she came up with $6 million, could even exploit, right? I mean, I think we know, to your point earlier, we know what the outcome's going to be, and I think he's fine. The fundamentals are there.
Yep. As we like to say, or I've noted over the years too, you've got some politicians love to campaign and hate to govern. Some politicians love to govern and hate to campaign, and I put him in that category of he likes to govern and not campaign.
And that's why, and that's what I mean by a weakness.
Yeah.
I mean, it as a candidate.
It's non-traditional, really.
Yeah. And I think there is no doubt that he's an effective legislator. He is by far the nicest human being in the congressional delegation. And that will ultimately serve him well in Washington. It serves him a little less well.
Just offended the whole congressional delegation, Jay,
No.
picking your favorite there.
Jay said that, I didn't say
All
that.
right, let's turn to the race for governor. We asked if the race were held today, which of the following candidates would you vote for? We've got Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the Republican, at 51%, Chris Jones, the Democrat, at 40%, Ricky Dale Harrington Jr., the Libertarian, at 2%, just 7% undecided in this race. That's an 11-point lead. That's a double-digit lead for Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But Chris Jones overperforming for a Democrat. And you have to say you can't have Joe Biden at 62% and not believe that Chris Jones is overperforming, particularly when you look at where Natalie James is, and in a minute where we'll see where Jesse Gibson is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it is an overperformance. I mean, I think that during the summer months, Chris Jones has worked incredibly hard in some small towns around the state and has enhanced his name recognition through a pretty effective grassroots campaign.
I think social media too. He's been
he
active
has
on
been
social
very,
media.
very effective on social media. He also became much more aggressive and assertive in attacking Donald Trump, which I think, as our previous conversation suggests, was well timed in terms of where Trump's numbers are. So he's definitely brought Democrats home, and he's impressed some more moderate independents as well. The thing is, this is a good poll result for him, but he's still losing by 11 points. And,
With 7% undecided.
Yeah, and it is pretty much a pretty perfect storm. The Dobbs decision has happened. Trump's numbers have gone south. You've got recreational marijuana out there, which is a plus for him. And even with that fairly perfect storm, it's a really challenging environment for any Democrat, even one as talented and as well liked as Chris Jones.
This race isn't going to finish at 51-40. No. Where do you think Sarah Huckabee gets to?
No, I think she'll increase to even more comfortable margin when it comes to election day. She has millions of dollars left to spend. Geographically, she's running up, big margins in CD4 and CD1, over somewhere around 20 points in both. I think the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is, we talked about earlier, and I believe this is probably a high water mark for Democrats and a low water mark for Republicans. I think this race probably measures that. The post-Dobbs, Donald Trump's numbers coming down. I think Sarah Huckabee Sanders was in a primary campaign. She had to run a primary campaign. She had to be as assertive on Republican core issues as she could. Chris Jones had a primary campaign, but we all know that it wasn't competitive. He was the only one with money. He had the luxury of kind of being out there with a general electorate message from day one, right? He didn't have to go super liberal to out-liberal the other Democratic candidates. And so he's kind of been in that middle area longer, and Sarah, is now probably looking at things and saying, I know I already have a general election message. I know what I want to talk about. I want to talk about issues that matter to people. I want to talk about policy, and that's probably where she's headed.
What is that general election message? We haven't seen it yet.
We haven't seen it yet.
We're still seeing the CNN ad.
She's
and we're
talked
still
about
seeing
education a little bit. I think that's probably going to be a cornerstone.
But it's been an indoctrination versus education message. That's a primary message.
And the question is there a pivot to more specifics? I mean, if it were me, I would hearken back to the days of George W. Bush and look at the compassionate conservative message. What is that? I think that can touch things like education. I think you can talk about how do we create incentives for businesses to create childcare? How do we create incentives for workforce development? Those are all things that the electorate at large really likes. And I think if you can put a compassionate conservative policy orientation on those, I think that you've got something you can deliver to people.
Yeah, she's still not talking about that, and she's up 51-40, and we think that it could grow.
She has been quite invisible this summer. I think she's really kind of been fairly low-key. this summer. That's about to change, and we'll see. I'm very curious whether she goes negative or goes in a more positive direction
Right.
and I think her instinct is to go a little negative. Chris Jones is a pretty likable guy without much of a record, and it is a little hard to go negative on him.
One angle that maybe play into that, you would obviously anticipate that her support would be higher amongst people that strongly favor Donald Trump, and it is, and people that somewhat favor Donald Trump, and it is. But she's even getting 31% or so of people that find Trump somewhat unfavorable. So there is a group of people out there that don't really like Donald Trump that are still voting for her. They're not undecided, they're voting for her. I think that group of people matters.
One more question here, and we'll have to be a little short on this just due to time. So we asked about the Attorney General's race. Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin, the Republican candidate, at 49%. Jesse Gibson, the Democrat, at 32%. 19% undecided. There's no third candidate in that race. That's a 17-point lead for Tim Griffin. He has to feel pretty good about that.
17 points is the biggest margin that we found in any of the races. I think he's got to feel good about that. He leads in all the congressional districts, especially in CD4 and 2, where he's got family history and previously served in Congress in the old CD2. All the fundamentals are there, men, women, there's no danger.
Yeah. I would argue too that 19% undecided, and there was 21% undecided in the Senate race, a single digit in the governor's race. Those may be people that kind of know how they're going to vote. They're just not ready to tell us how they're going to vote. So,
exactly.
Yeah. Anything in the Tim Griffin? Jesse Gibson
I think Griffin really does pull together the coalition very well. He's probably he pulls together more Trump voters, but he also pulls in, more establishment country club conservatives. He's really the best coalitional candidate on the ballot this time, and he is a very strong candidate.
And he's a calculating Politico.
Yes, he is.
So are we. The three of us are too. Always fun to dissect numbers with you guys. Dr. J. Barth, Robert Coon, thank you so much.
Awesome.